Welcome to another episode of The Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today is the final installment of a three-part series on how healing happens. In today's episode, we are going to talk about what happens when you linger in death, what happens when you are faithful to be in the place you find yourself, namely a place of sorrow, grief, even at times despair. Like in the last two episodes, today's teaching is based on the U diagram, which was developed by Cathy Loerzel of the Allender Center. Oftentimes, the place we find ourselves is a place of desert, of wilderness, of valley. And indeed, these are places of death, and they are real, and they are part of the process of healing, but they are not the last word. Today, we are going to talk about what it looks like to ascend back up the other side of the U into a place of resurrection, newness, healing, hope, joy. Before we begin, just a request, if you find this podcast beneficial, please consider supporting it financially. I don't want to interrupt the podcast with a sponsor's ad. I hate it when other podcasts do that. But it costs a lot to produce the podcast each week. So you can help fund the podcast by going to adamyoungcounseling.com and clicking on support the podcast. Thank you for considering it. And now let's dive into part 3 of how healing happens. Here's the thesis. If we are faithful to enter death, to dip down to the bottom of the U, then resurrection and indeed healing will begin to exist. The promise of Jesus is in Isaiah 61, which Jesus quotes in Luke chapter 4, and it's simply this: to comfort all who mourn. That is why Jesus says he was sent, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion. This is Isaiah 61, verse 3, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. There it is. There's the U. It's all there. Jesus is saying that he has been sent to comfort those who mourn, to bestow on them beauty, joy, praise. Now, for that kind of healing to exist, what I have been suggesting is that it requires several things. It requires that you enter stories of harm, heartache, abuse. It requires that you name yourself and others well in those stories. And this almost always requires another person to help you, because it's hard for us to see ourselves accurately. Healing requires that you experience the emotions and sensations linked to those stories. And healing requires that you let the heartache of the story carry you into grief and sorrow. And then finally, that you receive the comfort of God, who knows your sorrow and knows your grief. The only way to come to know resurrection is through death. A simple question: do you believe in resurrection? Not the resurrection. That's not the question. I'm asking, do you believe in resurrection? There is a world of difference between believing in the resurrection and believing in resurrection. Many Christians believe in the resurrection without believing in resurrection. The essence of resurrection is the rescue of God. We'll get to this at the very end of the podcast, but I'll just give you a preview. The essence of resurrection is always a surprise, it's always a gift, and it's always unique to you and your heart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Many of us want to know, where was God during this experience or during that experience? We want to know where God was during our heartache. And sometimes we will do a lot of reflecting and thinking to try to find God in our stories. But here's an alternative to that approach, which I first heard from Dan Allender. Dan says, you don't have to find God in your stories. God will show himself in your stories if you are faithful to enter death. You don't have to find God in your stories. He will show himself if you are faithful to enter death. Think back to the U diagram. We want to jump from Friday to Sunday while skipping Saturday. The hard part about Saturday, and Saturday is what Dan means by death. The hard part about Saturday is that Saturday is the reality that you do not know you're going to ever come out of the grief. You do not know that you're going to come out of the sorrow. Saturday is precisely when you don't know that you're going to be okay. We don't want to enter Saturday because on Saturday we are truly out of control. We are no longer in control of our healing process. God is. Saturday, in other words, is terrifying. When you dip down into Saturday and you consider letting your grief and your sorrow just bubble up and just sitting with it, you may have this sense of, I'm afraid that if I start crying, I'll never stop. That is Saturday. What you're saying is, hey, how do I know that if I go there, it will be okay? How do I know that if I go there, I will come back from there? That is precisely the Saturday experience. It's not knowing that God will come through. In fact, every day that you enter death and experience no resurrection is another day of evidence that God won't show up. There's no way to follow Christ without experiencing what he experienced, namely, a Saturday season where God is completely silent and there is no resurrection on the horizon. Now, during the Saturday experience, the temptation is to try and conjure up hope. You don't have to do that. You do not have to conjure up hope. You just have to have the courage to name your despair and to name your war with hope. In other words, to name how terrifying hope can feel. What is most required is your presence. That is staying in your body and being open to exploring how bad things really are. Why don't you need to conjure up hope? Because hope is written into your very being. It's written into the very fibers of your being. We are created in the image of God, and there is no way to get hope completely out of us. If you're even listening to this podcast, you have a fair bit of hope. It's not that you lack hope. That's not your problem. It's that you hate the hope that you have. For more on hope, you can check out episode 18. The tendency is to feel like, hey, if I'm going to step into this grief, if I'm going to let myself go down the U and feel these feelings, then I better know that there is something solid down there to hold me up. You think you need to find something solid that you can walk on before you enter the grief. Something that you feel like will hold you up as you enter grief. But the Saturday experience is about falling. It's about not knowing it's going to be okay. Think of the women and the 12 disciples the day after Jesus is crucified. Nothing is okay. And please hear the next phrase. Nothing is going to be okay. Ever. Why? Because he's dead. The Saturday experience often feels utterly meaningless as well as hopeless, and there is usually an absence of words. You lose the ability to find language to explain what you are experiencing at the bottom of the U. Your heartache and despair must be spoken about, but it can be extremely hard to find words. And frankly, many Saturday experiences connect you to pre-verbal moments of your life, moments before you had the capacity for language, moments that were absolutely terrifying for you. I want to press this point about how much we resist dipping down into the bottom of the U, dipping down into sorrow, grief, despair. I mean, we don't only do this with our own pain and our own stories. We do this with others' pain as well. When someone is telling you about their pain or their discouragement or their despair or how hopeless they feel, don't you feel the pull to try to say something to get them out of those feelings? What is that? That's you conspiring with them to pop them back up out of the death of Saturday. Have you felt your own discomfort when someone gets close to their terror? When someone is talking to you and they get close to despair, or they get close to sorrow or shame? Have you felt your own discomfort when that happens? When a friend is feeling hopeless about something, what gets stirred in you? Don't you search your soul for something to say that will get them out of that horrible feeling? Do you try to say something that will give them reason to hope? We've all done this. Why do we do this? Here's why. In our attempt to get a friend out of pain, we often rush from Friday to Sunday while skipping Saturday. We refuse to linger in death. All too often, we do an end run around death, and here's why. Because we are uncomfortable with the other person's overwhelming emotions. Many potentially transformative moments are missed because of our discomfort with the emotions that surface as the other person comes close to a scene of trauma or heartache. And here's why. Here's the core of it. As the storyteller experiences the terror and sorrow and shame of their stories of death, we become limbically connected to their experience of death, which connects immediately to our own places of death. And if we have not lingered in our own despair, in our own terror, in our own sorrow, and found the rebirth of hope, then our discomfort will prompt us to pull the storyteller out of the precise place where profound transformation and healing can occur for them. The reason we conspire with someone else to pop them out of the bottom of the U is because we are uncomfortable with what's getting stirred up in us as they connect to their painful emotions. And that precludes us from being with them in their heartache, in their despair, in their Saturday. There is no easy solution to popping up out of the U. In other words, we all do it all the time. There's no way to just stop it. But once you are aware that you have popped up, the next question is, how would you like to re-enter the story and return to the sorrow or grief or despair that you were feeling just a moment ago? Will you have a posture of kind curiosity toward yourself in that moment, simply to ask, what emotion or bodily sensation did I just experience that felt too much to bear, and so I had to pop up? This is how you make movement towards sliding back down the U. I will never forget when Dan Allender said the following two sentences, which broke something just wide open for me. And this is what he said: the hard work of life is not dealing with your pain. The hard work of life is allowing yourself to experience comfort. Namely, receiving another's kindness and being kind to yourself. I'll say it again. The hard work of life is not dealing with your pain. That's not it. The hard work of life is allowing yourself to experience comfort, which means either receiving another's kindness or being kind to your own heart. The invitation to grief is not an invitation merely to grieve alone, but far more to grieve with another person who has the strength and the tenderness to hold space for the grief and to point you to comfort, kindness, and care. Let me say it again. When I am inviting you to grieve, it is not an invitation only to grieve alone. Much grief happens by ourselves, but if it is only by ourselves, there is something that is going to be missed. Far more, the invitation is to grieve with another. Another person who has the strength and the tenderness to hold space for your grief and to point you to comfort, kindness, and care. Look, the reality is that most of us would rather grieve alone for a week than grieve for 10 minutes with someone else. Why is this? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but here is one of the biggest. I'll say it and then I'll explain it. For many people with a history of trauma, the person who offered you kindness, care, and comfort was often the same person who abused you. For many people with a history of trauma, the person who offered you kindness, care, and comfort was very often the very person who went on to abuse you. I want to let that sink in. This is often a nauseating truth the first time you realize it. The point is this: if the person who violated you, the person who abused you, also offered you care, kindness, attention, affirmation, then receiving another's comfort will feel way too close to how you were groomed by your abuser. Grooming simply refers to the ways that your abuser cared for you in such a way that you became connected to them and that you began to trust them. This grooming, which always involves kindness and care, is what set you up for the abuse. So, for many of you, your brain has paired comfort, care, and kindness with something bad is about to happen. Do you see the pairing? When someone is kind to you, you know in your gut that there has to be a catch. What does this person want from me? What is going to be asked of me? What is going to be required of me? You see the dilemma. What the human heart most needs is kindness, is care, is comfort. But evil has woven into your story a pairing of kindness with violation and harm. So now you are suspicious of kindness, of care, of comfort, even if you don't want to be. Your body is suspicious of these things. Another sentence from Dan Allender that disrupted me in such a good way. He says, comfort is often misdefined as what takes away anxiety. Comfort, however, is not an absence of anxiety. It is receiving kindness from another and being kind to yourself in the midst of your anxiety. I'll say it again. Comfort is often misdefined as what takes away anxiety, but comfort is not an absence of anxiety. Comfort is receiving kindness from another and being kind to yourself in the midst of your anxiety. Whenever you are overwhelmed or anxious or in despair, the most important question is simply this: is there kindness here? From myself or from another person? Can there be kindness for me as a response to my overwhelm, to my anxiety, to my despair? When you are having a particularly painful day, that is precisely the time to receive God's comfort because your body is suffering. Will you let Him comfort your suffering body? You don't have to respond to your story by striving, by enduring, by grinding it out. You don't have to respond to your story by turning against yourself with all manner of accusations. All accusations are a form of self-violence. You don't have to respond to your story by joining in violence against yourself. You can respond to your story the way God does, with kindness toward your frailty. You can respond to your story with kindness rather than violence toward your frailty, toward your need, toward your desperation. Here is a maxim you can count on. If you don't choose kindness, you can't enter sorrow, and you will therefore miss the comfort of God. If you don't choose kindness, you can't enter sorrow. You cannot find a place of sorrow when there is contempt, accusation, violence against your heart. And if you can't find sorrow, you can't find the comfort of God. The essence of comfort is the word with. It's about having someone with you. The word comfort comes from the Latin prefix com, meaning with, plus fortis, meaning strong, like forte, playing piano strongly, as in a strong fort. Thus, comfort means to be with someone to strengthen them. Comfort carries with it two parts: to be with, that's the com, and to strengthen, that's the fort. And anytime someone is truly with you, you are strengthened. It's axiomatic. When someone is truly with you, you can't help but be strengthened. God is named Emmanuel, which means God with us. When someone is truly with you, it does not mean that they understand you completely. It means that they have the courage to enter your hurt because they have a desire to hear you and a desire to understand you. And it means that they have the kindness to be with you in a way that is both strong and tender. If you are in an hour of need and you are with someone who is nice, nothing can feel more alone. Niceness does not strengthen us. It just makes us feel more alone. Kindness strengthens. So back to the whole subject of violence against your heart. When do you tend to turn against your heart? When are you tempted to join evil in accusations against you? It is not primarily when you are hurting. Rather, it is when you are hurting and there is the possibility of comfort. We are most inclined to turn against our own heart, not when we are hurting per se. It is when we are hurting and there is the possibility of comfort. Comfort that you don't know what to do with because it reminds you too much of something nauseating in your own story. How does healing happen? Truth is required, but in the end, it is not truth that changes people. It is kindness. Kindness, in and of itself, begins to disrupt the power of evil. And when evil is disrupted, the body begins to naturally heal. The more we engage our story with kindness, the more our brain seems to change. The more we are open to the possibility of comfort, the more our brain seems to change. Now, last, I want to talk a bit about the surprise of resurrection. What does it look like to ascend up the other side of the U into the Sunday experience of healing, of joy, of the restoration of peace and shalom to your heart? We can say I just want to say four things about the ascent up the other side. Number one, healing is not a return to the old status quo. It is never a return to the old status quo. Again, the Psalms are our guide. If you immerse yourself in the Psalms, you will see a pattern repeating over and over. It's the movement from what Paul Ricoeur called orientation to disorientation to reorientation. That movement is all over the Psalter. Orientation, that's when your life made sense. Before the crisis, whatever it is for you, before your addiction got out of control, before your marriage fell apart, before you became so deeply disappointed with God, you were in a place of orientation and life was normal and it made sense. Disorientation is when life as you understood it gets upended and blown to pieces. Disorientation is the slide down from Friday into the confusion and grief of Saturday. Reorientation is what we are talking about right now. It's the movement up into resurrection, healing, shalom. The first point I want to make about the resurrection experience, the experience of healing, is that it is not a return to the old status quo. Jesus' resurrected body looked different. I mean, that should just stun us. It was not a return to what had been before. It was something wholly new. Here's how Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann puts it. Reorientation, that is resurrection, is not a return to normalcy as though nothing had happened. It is rather all things new. Which brings us to point number 2. The movement up into joy and vitality and healing is always a surprise. Always, always. I don't care how many times God has already come through for you. It's still a surprise when God does it this time, in this situation, with this mess. Here again, I'm going to quote Brueggemann 2 more times. Here's how he puts it. Here's how he explains it. The reorientation has both continuities with and discontinuities from what has been, but the accent is on the new. It is a surprise. In our resistance, Brueggemann goes on to say, we do not expect to be surprised. The new situation is not an achievement or a working out of the crisis, but it is a newness that comes to us. Walter Brueggemann. So brilliant, so true, so what we see in the book of Psalms. It is a surprise. Healing is always a surprise, and in our resistance, we do not expect to be surprised. Which leads to point number 3. The experience of healing is always a gift. It's a gift. You can't strive your way up into resurrection. It is something to be received, not something to be attained. It's always a gift. Healing is something to be received, not attained. One of the hardest things to grapple with is this simple question. What if the world is ordered by gifts rather than achievements? What if the world is ordered by gifts? Resurrection, healing, is always a place you find yourself in. It's not a destination that you arrived at through strenuous effort. Though grief requires strenuous and sometimes exhausting effort, the place we find ourselves is, at times, a place of resurrection and genuine newness. And when it happens, it is always a gift. And last time, quoting Brueggemann, I can't move on without quoting him. Here's how he puts it. Reorientation, that is resurrection, is always a surprise and a gift. It always comes to us just when we thought it not possible, when we could not see how it could be wrought in the present circumstance. The reorientation is not an achievement coming from us. It is not an automatic next stage, but it is something we receive when we did not expect it at all. Life falls into patterns of wholeness where we did not think it could happen, precisely and only because God is at work. Walter Brueggemann. Healing is always a gift. It's not an automatic next stage. It's something we receive when we didn't expect it at all. Okay, number 4, final point. Healing is always unique to you. unique to your heart. Another way of saying this is that the experience of healing always bears a certain mystery to it. It's mysterious. It's hard to put into words the experience of moving from grief to vitality and joy and healing. In part, this is because it looks different for each person. It has to look different for each person because God is relentlessly committed to fathering each of us in the unique way that fits our hearts best. And God is relentlessly committed to mothering each of us in the unique way that fits our hearts best. Therefore, the way God rescues and restores your heart will be different than the manner in which God rescues and restores my heart. And although I find this incredibly annoying, it's also kind of beautiful when you think about it. So, summary. The experience of healing is 1, never a return to the old status quo. 2, always a surprise. 3, always a gift. And 4, always unique to you and to your heart. May it be so. May you experience the healing of God in some of the darkest, scariest corners of your heart. God loves to dwell there. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. It is truly a privilege to be on this journey with you. Have a good week.